Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. I've always believed our quiet street was the safest place in the world. Rows of manicured lawns, polished mailboxes, and neatly trimmed hedges once made this neighborhood feel like a timeless sanctuary. My partner and I built our lives here. We had plans to grow old in this place. I remember weekend barbecues, morning jogs around the cul-de-sac, and gatherings where neighbors exchanged friendly waves. That sense of calm, however, was a thin veneer, one that could crack at any moment. My life changed on a day that began much like any other. It was early spring, and my partner had been feeling under the weather for several days. I did what I could, offered warm meals, fluffed pillows, and kept the atmosphere calm. Our child was just old enough to run around the house, sprinkling laughter in every room. As any parent knows, an energetic kid can quickly turn a household upside down. But this was the type of chaos I cherished. That morning, I woke up before dawn to prepare breakfast. The birds outside chirped in scattered bursts. My partner had been coughing all night, so I wanted to do something thoughtful, maybe a bowl of hot soup, even though it was a bit early for that. I was chopping vegetables when I noticed a small bruise on the back of my hand. At first, I assumed it was from some minor bump the previous day. I brushed it off and continued preparing the soup. By the time I'd set the tray on our bedroom nightstand, I felt a slight burning sensation around that spot on my hand. It reminded me of a light graze against a stove burner, just enough to sting, but not enough to cause alarm. Our child burst into the room, excited to see breakfast in bed. Kids do that. They see a simple act as a moment of wonder. In the flurry of the moment, my child reached for me, trying to climb into my lap. That's when a tiny set of teeth grazed my hand. It wasn't intended to hurt me, just an overly enthusiastic nibble during playful roughhousing. I winced but tried not to show it. My child giggled, not realizing the minor pain inflicted. After all, children test boundaries. I cleaned the area, applied a small bandage, and considered it no more serious than a bug bite. Life continued. My partner stayed in bed, dozing in and out of a restless state. I noticed beads of sweat forming on their forehead. That cough persisted. In the back of my mind, I began to worry. Some new flu was going around. At least that was what the local news had been mentioning lately. Still, everything felt so distant. Our suburb rarely dealt with anything more alarming than a missing cat poster or an occasional power outage. That illusion of safety shifted a few days later. My partner's fever soared, and I began to experience odd symptoms too. The bruise on my hand, along with that faint bite mark from my child, had started to look worse. It was darker, almost black at the center, and it pulsed with an unpleasant warmth. I kept it covered under a bandage, more out of embarrassment than fear. The only person I showed it to was my partner, who through a haze of exhaustion managed only a vague expression of concern. During those next days, I noticed a creeping sense of detachment. It's challenging to put into words how it felt, because at first it was subtle, like walking into a room and forgetting why you came, or glancing at your reflection and feeling disconnected from the person in the mirror. My appetite dwindled, and ordinary things tasted bland. Water seemed to have no flavor. Foods that I used to enjoy, pasta, bread, roasted vegetables, barely registered on my tongue. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was just overworked, balancing the demands of a sick partner, an active child, and daily chores. Then, one morning, I woke up feeling oddly cold. The room temperature was normal, but my body felt as though I had lost all warmth. When I touched my skin, it was clammy. I stood up, and a wave of lightheadedness almost toppled me. My vision blurred at the edges. For a moment, I had to grip the edge of the dresser to stay upright. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes appeared dull, and my cheeks, normally flushed, looked drained. My partner was still asleep, so I ventured downstairs to see if I could find anything to help me feel better. Maybe some hot tea or a piece of fruit. The next part is somewhat embarrassing to admit, but as I searched the fridge, I felt repulsed by the sight of everything. Fresh produce, leftover meatloaf, cartons of juice. None of it appealed to me. In fact, it triggered a wave of nausea. Strange thoughts began to swirl in my mind. I felt restless. Yet, I didn't want my partner or our child to worry. If I showed them how off I felt, it might add stress when we could least afford it. So I kept my condition to myself. After all, I reasoned, it was likely just the same bug my partner had. However, by the next night, I knew this was more than a simple fever. The bruise on my hand had taken on a spidery pattern, with thin lines spreading outward. The area around the small bite mark felt unpleasant to the touch. Whenever I tried to eat, I was overcome with an odd compulsion to push the food away. Nothing smelled enticing, nothing tasted right. My partner's condition was declining as well, but in a different way. Extreme fatigue, constant cough, and watery eyes. The following day, I heard a local news report crackle through the living room television. It mentioned people across several neighborhoods complaining of new infections marked by dizziness, skin discoloration, and, in some extreme instances, odd behavioral changes. The reporter was calm, but the subtext hinted at growing concern. Words like quarantine and containment surfaced. The broadcast ended abruptly, switching to a press conference clip, showing a few medical professionals who seemed uneasy, answering questions from a small group of journalists. For the first time, I felt genuine alarm creeping into my thoughts. Something about the reporter's tone, the cautious wording, suggested a serious threat. I recalled the initial stories from overseas about a virus that caused individuals to exhibit intense aggression. Rumors of it jumped around the internet, but we dismissed them as hoaxes. Now, I wasn't so sure. My partner, who had been drifting in and out of a light sleep, groaned from the sofa. I rushed over, feeling a wave of guilt. I should have been paying more attention. My partner's forehead was as hot as an iron. I dabbed it with a cool cloth, noting the glassy look in their eyes. For a brief moment, I wondered if this was contagious enough to threaten our child. If so, how could I isolate us both? The entire house felt too small. That night was long and restless. Each time I closed my eyes, my mind lurched with unsettling images. Shadows crossing the windows, neighbors moving silently across their lawns with vacant expressions. When I awoke, the images felt strangely real, as though my dreams had begun to bleed into reality. By morning, my partner was delirious. Their skin was clammy to the touch, and their breath sounded shallow. I rushed to call our usual clinic, only to get a series of busy tones and automated messages. An advisory played repeatedly. Due to increased calls, please stand by or call back at a later time. Panicked, I tried the local hospital next. The line connected, but the person on the other end spoke in a tense whisper. I heard frantic voices in the background. They took down our address, advised me to remain calm, and said medical assistance would arrive if possible. Then the line went dead. The situation was spiraling beyond my control. I remember standing in the middle of the living room, phone clutched in hand, feeling a deep sense of dread. In that moment, our child peered around the corner, looking at me with wide eyes. I forced a reassuring nod and guided them back upstairs, insisting everything was fine. Kids can sense when adults are scared, so I tried my best to hide it. When I checked my own reflection again, I noticed more alarming changes. The bruise had spread further, and my normally clear skin was dotted with strange patches of discoloration. My lips felt perpetually dry, and my eyes seemed sunken. Even my voice sounded off, as though it were coming from a distance. I attempted to drink water, but an unfamiliar revulsion rose in me. My senses were betraying me. The concept of thirst lingered, yet nothing quenched it. A new type of craving grew, one that I didn't understand and tried to suppress. My thoughts fixated on something intangible, something that made me feel uneasy even acknowledging. I powered on my laptop to check the local news sites. Most were slow to load, possibly overrun with traffic. A few stories caught my eye. Abrupt closures of schools, an advisory to stay indoors, and pleas from local authorities to avoid public gatherings. The headlines whispered of a spreading outbreak. Symptoms included increased irritability, changes in skin pigmentation, and a sharp decline in rational thought. The word zombie appeared in sensationalist blog posts, but official outlets avoided such a description. My child hovered behind me, reading over my shoulder. I quickly closed the tab, not wanting them to see. At that moment, I felt a pang of remorse. Children shouldn't have to witness a world unraveling. Yet here we were, in the midst of something we never could have anticipated. Time blurred after that. My own condition was growing more concerning with each hour. Whatever I had contracted was sapping my energy and warping my senses. My thoughts felt fragmented. Sometimes, I would pace the living room and forget what I was doing. Other times, I'd find myself staring out the window at a neighbor's house, unconsciously gripping the windowsill, nails scraping the paint. I remember hearing strange sounds from outside, anxious voices, car doors slamming, occasional sirens in the distance. The hush of suburban life was broken by an undercurrent of panic. Yet, nobody came to our door. The medical professionals never arrived. The phone lines, when I tried again, were in constant loops of recorded messages. At one point, my child came downstairs complaining of hunger. I tried to piece together a meal, but realized we were running low on groceries. My attempts to eat anything were fruitless. Even the act of preparing food felt surreal. I watched my child nibble on a granola bar with childlike innocence, while I wrestled with an overwhelming sense that everything was unspooling. Then, something unthinkable happened. My partner, who had been motionless on the sofa, stirred awake with eyes that looked glazed. They mumbled something I couldn't make out. When I leaned in closer, they raised a trembling arm. We locked eyes for a second. I tried to speak, tried to offer comfort, but my partner let out a low sound that didn't resemble a normal word. It was as though language had dissolved in their throat. I backed away, feeling lightheaded again. That sense of dread weighed heavier now. My partner's movements were stiff, as if every joint ached. The cough that had plagued them for days was gone, replaced by silence. Silence can be more terrifying than the most harrowing noise when it means the body has abandoned normal function. I approached carefully, resting a hand on their shoulder. The moment I touched them, they jerked with a start and turned to face me. Their eyes held a vacant stare, but it wasn't quite empty. There was a flash of something primal behind them. A part of me wanted to recoil, to run upstairs, lock the door, and pretend this wasn't happening. But fear had a strange hold on me. I stood there, breathing unevenly, while my partner reached out. In one abrupt motion, they grasped at my arm. The grip was strong, too strong for someone who had been in such a weak state. A sharp pressure near my forearm forced me to pull away. I stumbled back, nearly losing balance. My partner remained on the sofa, leaning forward, head tilted in an unsettling angle. A wave of adrenaline coursed through me, but I refused to show alarm in front of our child. They were upstairs, probably playing with some toys or reading a storybook, blissfully unaware of the bizarre scene unfolding below. I tried to steady myself, speaking in a calm voice, even though it felt unnatural. "It's going to be okay. We're going to get help." But some instinct told me we wouldn't. Not really. Later, when I checked on my child, I noticed they were dozing peacefully in their room. Toys scattered across the floor, a blanket pulled halfway up. I closed the door softly and felt a pang of guilt and relief. At least the child wasn't witnessing these disturbing changes. I decided to move my partner to the basement. That sounds callous, I know, but a part of me feared they would unintentionally harm our child, or me. My own limbs felt weak and my mind was foggy, but I managed to guide my partner down the stairs. They stumbled with each step, releasing occasional raspy sounds. When we reached the bottom, I helped them settle on an old sofa we kept in the corner. I flicked on the single light bulb overhead. The dull glow revealed stacks of boxes, a worn-out rug, and shelves filled with items we rarely used. A sense of unease washed over me. This place, once used for storage or the occasional quiet retreat, now felt like a hidden chamber of worry. My partner's condition was concerning, but I had no idea what to do. Hospitals were not an option. It seemed impossible to get help. I thought of calling a neighbor but quickly dismissed the idea. What would they do, other than panic? I pressed the back of my hand against my partner's cheek. The skin was cool, yet there was a faint warmth pulsing just beneath the surface. My partner's stare locked onto me for a moment, then drifted to a distant point in the corner of the basement. They seemed disoriented, caught in a cycle of confusion. Worse yet, I felt changes in myself. My reflection in the basement's dusty mirror was unsettling. My posture had become hunched, my eyes ringed with shadows. The bruise on my hand had spread into my wrist, creating a pattern reminiscent of spiderwebs. Even my hair looked limp and lifeless. I tried to speak out loud to gather my thoughts. At first, words came in short bursts, like I had to force them into the air. This was terrifying. I had always taken speaking for granted, but now it felt like each sentence might slip away into incoherence. Despite everything, a part of me clung to the responsibilities of a parent. My child's well-being was the only clear priority in my mind. So I climbed back upstairs, prepared a small meal, mostly snacks, and left it on the kitchen table in case they woke up hungry. Then I returned to the basement with a notepad and pen. I sat on the floor, resting against a pile of boxes, determined to write down everything I was experiencing. I hoped it could serve as a record for some future moment, maybe for medical professionals, or perhaps just for me to track my own thoughts. My handwriting was shaky. I managed to scrawl a few lines, feeling cold, bruise spreading, partner in a trance-like state, child still okay, neighborhood quiet, no rescue in sight. As I continued, it grew harder to concentrate. My vision would haze over, and I'd lose track of my pen. The page became a mess of uneven words and scribbles. Eventually, I dropped the pen entirely and just stared at the paper. Time lost its usual rhythm. Hours seemed to pass in a haze. I do remember hearing noises from upstairs. Possibly our child wandering around, calling for me. I must have answered, but I can't recall the specifics of what I said. My partner remained in that half-lucid state, occasionally twitching or letting out low groans. When I mustered the energy to climb the stairs again, I found our child sitting in front of the TV. The broadcast showed an emergency bulletin, but the audio was garbled. A text banner read, "Stay indoors. Lock all entrances if experiencing symptoms of aggression. Contact local authorities if you suspect infection." My child looked at me with a worried expression, as if asking for reassurance. I attempted to say something gentle. My voice felt unnaturally soft, almost distant. They nodded, probably confused, but accepted it. The innocence of youth can be both heartwarming and heartbreaking. I set out a blanket for my child in the living room, intending to keep them close. The phone lines still didn't work. The power flickered a few times, but never fully went out. The only consistent light was the dusty glow from our lamps, casting flickering shadows on the walls. As the hours passed, my own muscles began to ache. Each step felt laborious, as though my bones were weighted. My mind drifted toward odd, repetitive thoughts. I fixated on the memory of that small bite on my hand. There was a compulsion to scratch around it until the skin flaked. I tried to resist, but sometimes caught myself absent-mindedly rubbing at the bandage. At one point, I realized my child was looking at me from across the room, an uneasy expression on their face. In that moment, I recognized that my own behavior might be frightening them. Without a word, I tried to offer a comforting gesture, but my limbs felt unsteady. I settled on a reassuring nod, though it likely did little to ease their concerns. Eventually, late in the evening, I returned to the basement. My partner was seated on the sofa, upright now. They didn't speak when I approached. There was an unusual odor in the air, something musty and sour. I kept my distance, not out of rejection, but out of fear that my presence might trigger something in them or me. An uncertain period followed. My memory of those next hours is fragmented. I recall searching the basement, possibly looking for medical supplies or anything useful. I might have rummaged through boxes labeled winter clothes and camping gear, though I'm not sure what I hoped to find. Perhaps a hidden stash of antiseptics or something to bring down a fever. I found none of it. The only items were dusty blankets, old flashlights, and holiday decorations. At one point, I felt a sudden wave of dizziness and collapsed against a metal shelving unit. My head pounded from the impact. For a brief moment, my vision dimmed. When it cleared, I saw my partner watching me from across the room. They had that same vacant stare, but now it held a flicker of intensity, as though they were drawn to my movement. A harsh scraping sound came from the top of the stairs. I froze, holding my breath. Then I recognized it as the basement door. It was our child, possibly checking on us. I didn't want them to come downstairs. I was afraid of what they might see. With difficulty, I forced myself to speak, telling them to wait upstairs. My voice sounded raspy, and I doubted if they even recognized it as mine. Not long after, I noticed my partner had shifted closer. Their movements were abrupt, lacking any hint of normal coordination. I took a step back, conflicted. This was the person I loved, the person I built a family with, yet something in them wasn't right anymore. I caught a glimpse of their hand. It showed the same pattern of dark veins and bruises that I had on mine. The days became a blur. I lost track of how many times the phone rang with an automated message. No one came to our aid. The internet connection faltered. Social media was full of rumors. Some posted harrowing videos of neighbors turning into something beyond recognition. Others insisted it was a government cover-up, while some tried to organize local rescue teams. My child fell into a quiet routine, sensing that the situation was grave. They slept on the living room couch, and I did my best to stay near them. Yet my body ached more with every sunrise. Eating was nearly impossible, and ordinary liquids provided no relief. My temperature fluctuated between chills and feverish flushes. At times, I felt almost normal, only to find myself drifting into a hollow state minutes later. The house took on a stale atmosphere. That once inviting living room where we read bedtime stories now felt like an alien space. Lights flickered and cast odd shapes on the walls, shapes that played tricks on my eyes. Eventually, I made the difficult decision to barricade the basement door. It felt cruel, but my partner's behavior had grown unpredictable. I heard them pacing at odd hours, letting out muffled sounds. Deep down, I knew they were no longer the same person. That hollow expression, those stiff movements. It reminded me of the warnings on the news. Words like zombie began to ring with truth, even though it felt absurd to label my loved one that way. After stacking chairs and a small bookcase against the basement door, I slumped to the floor, breathing heavily. My child sat a few feet away, their knees pulled up to their chest. The quiet between us carried more weight than any conversation could. In a moment of clarity, I reached out and stroked their hair, trying to offer some comfort. They leaned into me, perhaps trying to feel safe. I whispered that everything would be okay, though I didn't believe it myself. My voice sounded slurred, as if speech was slipping away from me. Later that evening, as I lay on the living room floor, too exhausted to move, I noticed the old photograph albums scattered on a nearby shelf. I summoned the last bit of energy to reach for them. Flipping through images of family gatherings, birthdays, and vacations felt surreal. We looked so healthy, so unaware of any coming threat. I recognized the progression in my reflection. The dull ache in my limbs was almost constant, and the sense of hunger remained, but it was not a normal hunger. My mind drifted to thoughts of raw sustenance, which I tried to push away. It was horrifying to realize that my own cravings were turning primal. All the while, faint noises resonated from the basement door. Shuffling steps, soft thuds. My partner was somewhere below, caught in the grip of this strange transformation. A part of me felt I was not far behind. I lost track of how many days passed like this. My child grew quieter. They mostly slept or read old storybooks. The television networks eventually ceased broadcasting anything coherent. Occasionally, an emergency message would appear on screen, urging people to remain locked in their homes and avoid contact with infected individuals. The message warned that these infected displayed reduced cognitive function and heightened aggression. I wanted to believe I wasn't there yet. But every time I caught my reflection, I saw the same vacant gaze. I moved more slowly each day, feeling as though I was drifting away from my own thoughts. My child seemed to sense it too. They clung to me, arms around my waist, as if to ground me in reality. One evening, I attempted to climb upstairs to the bedroom, hoping to find some medicine or anything that might help. My legs faltered, and I collapsed in the hallway. Images flickered across my mind. My partner's vacant eyes, our child's worried face, the empty streets outside. I tried to rise but could only manage a weak shuffle on hands and knees. In a fog of confusion, I realized the house was silent. My child must have dozed off in the living room. The barricaded basement door was still in place, but I felt an overwhelming urge to check on my partner, despite the risk. Crawling toward the basement door, I placed a hand against it. The wood felt cold. Suddenly, there was movement on the other side. The door rattled slightly as if someone or something was testing it. I froze, pressing my ear against the wood. The faint breathing on the other side was unnerving. A jolt of panic jolted through me, and I scrambled back, finally managing to stand. My breath came in ragged gasps. I spent that night propped against the living room wall, dozing in and out of awareness. My child slept fitfully nearby. Distant sirens occasionally cut through the stillness, but none came to our house. It felt as though the world had forgotten us. The next morning, I noticed my child stirring. They looked at me with wide eyes, clearly concerned about my pale skin and trembling movements. I did my best to reassure them, though my words were clumsy. Communication had become difficult, as if my mind had to fight through layers of static just to form a sentence. At one point, a noise outside drew my attention. Through the window, I spotted a figure walking along the sidewalk. They were hunched over, one arm limp at their side. My initial thought was that it might be a neighbor in need of help. But then they passed under a street lamp, and I saw the same vacant look that haunted my partner's face. The figure continued on, shuffling out of sight, leaving me with a chilling realization that this infection was spreading throughout the neighborhood. I tried to move across the living room, but my balance was gone. Each step was unsteady. My vision blurred, making the furniture seem to shift. My child steadied me, guiding me to the sofa. That was when I recognized how dire my situation had become. In my pocket, I still had the notepad from earlier attempts at journaling. I handed it to my child, pointing to the pen. They looked confused, but I tried to convey that they should keep track of things if I couldn't. A dull thumping noise rose from the basement again. My partner was still active, still pacing. I wished I could help them, cure them, but I knew that might be impossible now. Each passing moment made it clear that my own condition was on a similar path. To spare our child from witnessing my decline, I waited until they were distracted by the television's static-filled images. Then, using the last shred of willpower, I moved toward the basement. My intention was to confine myself there, away from my child, so that I wouldn't pose a threat once I fully lost control. I quietly pushed aside the makeshift barricade. The door creaked open and a stale odor wafted up. My partner stood at the bottom of the steps, gazing upward with unfocused eyes. Something inside me twisted at the sight. I could feel the infection pulsing through my veins, dulling my sense of reason. Step by step, I descended. My partner tilted their head, releasing a low, strained groan. I instinctively raised a hand as if to say, "I'm here." The basement was dim, illuminated only by that single light bulb. Dust motes floated in the air, and the hush was broken only by our labored breathing. Weakness overcame me at the foot of the stairs, and I sank to my knees. My partner remained where they were, swaying slightly, uncertain if I was a threat or an ally. This close, I could see the faint twitching in their facial muscles, the discolored flesh around their neck. Despite everything, part of me longed for some kind of recognition, a glimmer of the love we once shared, but no spark of familiarity crossed their eyes. I managed to crawl to the sofa, collapsing against it. My partner hovered a few feet away. A thick, suffocating silence enveloped us. My senses began to blur. Rational thought slipped further out of reach, replaced by alien impulses. My focus shifted to the rhythmic beating in my chest, which sounded oddly distant now, as though it belonged to someone else. Time lost all meaning. I recall hearing soft footsteps overhead, perhaps our child searching for me, or rummaging for food in the kitchen. A pang of sorrow coursed through me, but it was hard to sustain. Emotions were drifting away, replaced by a dull monotony. At some stage I realized my skin felt colder than ever. The bruise on my hand had merged with the dark veins creeping along my arm. My breath came in short, raspy intervals, my throat tight. Conflicting instincts welled up. Part of me wanted to climb back upstairs, hold my child close, and flee this place. Another part was beyond such concerns, drawn to an indescribable hunger that replaced normal urges. As the infection took hold, memories of normal life played in my mind like a distant movie. My child's laughter, weekend walks, the scent of fresh-cut grass, and the comfort of a warm bed. These recollections felt intangible now. I struggled to hold on to them, but they slipped away each time I blinked. I found myself hunched in a corner, knees drawn up, fingers digging into the cement floor. My partner paced near the stairs, occasionally pausing to look at me. It was as if we were both stuck in some half-awake world. My thoughts turned hazy, interspersed with faint images of the life we had before. The overhead light flickered. My partner jerked their head upward, releasing a low sound that might have been curiosity or frustration. I tried to remember how to speak, but no coherent words formed. My tongue felt thick, my jaw stiff. In that interminable twilight state, I wondered what had become of our child upstairs. Did they sense the changes? Perhaps they had locked themselves in a bedroom, afraid to venture down. I prayed they would stay safe, stay out of the basement. Eventually the house fell into a deep silence. The basement door never opened again. My partner and I remained in that dusky realm of half-awareness. My joints stiffened, my vision dulled. Sounds blurred into a steady drone. Each attempt to move felt robotic, lacking direction or clarity. The infection was complete, I realized. I was something else now, something that used to be human. Yet fragments of thought occasionally flared. I remember the faint echo of voices in the distance. Perhaps the authorities had finally arrived, or maybe it was the last few neighbors trying to escape. Everything remained distant, overshadowed by the primal haze that now dominated my mind. At some point, days or hours later I couldn't tell, a noise roused me from my trance-like state. The basement door creaked as if someone was trying to open it. My partner and I both looked up, bodies rigid. I heard footsteps. They weren't light enough to be our child's. It sounded like an adult. A sliver of light cut through the darkness as the door inched open. My partner let out a low hiss and staggered forward. The beam of a flashlight swept across the basement. I couldn't see who held it, only that the figure stepped cautiously down the stairs. They paused near the middle step, clearly spotting my partner's unsteady form. I heard a trembling voice say something like, "Hello?" But it was drowned out by the rasp coming from my partner's throat. The intruder's flashlight flickered toward me, and I tried to stand, though my body refused to cooperate. A sharp intake of breath from the stranger told me they'd witnessed our state. I heard them mutter an exclamation of disbelief. Words like zombie might have been uttered. My partner lurched forward, hands outstretched. The stranger backed up in alarm, the flashlight beam shaking wildly. In that moment, a surge of primal instinct overwhelmed me. I attempted to move, not fully sure why. The infection had left me with disjointed reflexes and a vague notion of hunger. The stranger panicked, stumbling on the steps, cursing under their breath. The flashlight clattered to the ground, its light spinning across the walls. I heard a scramble and the slam of the door. Footsteps retreated. There was a metallic click, possibly a latch or lock, sealing us in once more. Darkness reclaimed the basement, the flashlight beam now trapped, illuminating random corners from where it lay on the concrete floor. My partner stood near the stairs motionless, while I crawled toward the flashlight, drawn by its glow. But I was too weak. My limbs trembled, and my vision blurred until I collapsed. The final coherent thought I had was a fleeting memory of our quiet street on a sunny day. I recalled children playing, neighbors waving, and the aroma of barbecue in the air. A life that now seemed lost behind the veil of infection. In that silent basement, in the depths of an ordinary suburban home, the infection had done its work. I was a shell of the person I once was, barely conscious in a world turned upside down. And that is where my recollection ends. In the silence of suburbia, where an unspoken threat lurked beneath the facade of safety, where the living unknowingly sheltered the infected, and where I too became something unrecognizable, a cautionary tale of a zombie outbreak that took root in a home once filled with love and laughter. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, not even the silence.